Charlotte Lindström, The Shocking Truth Behind the Drug Lords, Crime Documentary. Hook. She thought she was just trying to survive. But when a mysterious man offers her a deal to save the one person she loves, Charlotte is pulled into a dangerous world where betrayal, power, and violence rule. Can she make it out alive, or is this the point of no return? Watch till the end to uncover the shocking twist that no one saw coming. Charlotte Lindström sat in the back of the black sedan, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The dim streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the wet pavement. Rain drummed against the windows, soft but persistent. Her heart pounded, each beat heavy, each breath shallow. She had always been careful, always in control. But tonight something felt wrong. The car's engine hummed steadily, but the air inside felt thick, almost suffocating. The driver's silence was unnerving. She could feel his eyes in the mirror, but he never spoke. Her fingers twitched against the cold leather seat, restless. A sudden sharp turn jolted her. Her stomach dropped. She wasn't sure where they were anymore. The familiar streets had disappeared, swallowed by unfamiliar alleyways and dark corners. The car slowed as it entered a narrow passage between two abandoned buildings. The headlights barely cut through the darkness ahead. Charlotte's senses were on high alert now. The hairs on her neck stood up. Something wasn't right. The car stopped. In the silence that followed, she could hear her own breathing, quick and shallow. A door slammed outside. She flinched, her hands gripping the seat tighter. Footsteps echoed on wet pavement, each step closer, closer. Then a voice. Gravelly, low. Get out. The driver spoke for the first time, his tone flat, devoid of any emotion. Charlotte hesitated, her mind racing. She had known this moment would come. She should have known better. But there was no turning back now. She opened the door, the cold night air hitting her face. Her boots clicked against the wet ground as she stepped into the darkness. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit alley, searching for any sign of movement. The distant hum of the city seemed miles away. Everything felt muffled, as if time itself had slowed. Then, from the shadows, figures emerged. 3 men. None of them spoke, but their presence was enough to send a shiver down her spine. The leader stepped forward, his face half hidden under the brim of his hat. "Where's the package?" he asked, his voice sharp, demanding. Charlotte swallowed hard. Her hand reached into her jacket, but she didn't pull anything out. Something was off. Her mind raced, looking for a way out. But the alley felt smaller now. Claustrophobic. The tension thickened. And just as she opened her mouth to speak, a sharp click echoed in the darkness. A gun. The cold steel of the barrel pressed against her temple. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze. The world around her went silent. Every breath, every movement, was measured. Her only thought? Escape. But there was no escape. Not this time. The men watched her closely, their eyes cold and calculating. The leader's grip tightened on the gun. "Where's the package?" he asked again. Charlotte's mind spun. Her world narrowed down to that single moment. Her pulse was deafening in her ears. She could feel the gun against her skin, cold, unforgiving. She wasn't sure what was worse, the threat of death, or the unknown. And then, as she opened her mouth to speak, the ground beneath her feet shifted. A loud, rumbling sound echoed through the alley. A screech of tires. A flash of headlights. A car came speeding around the corner. Charlotte's heart leapt. Her body tensed. Was it a rescue? Or something worse? The car came to a screeching halt just feet away from her. The door swung open. And for a split second, everything stood still. Then, in an instant, chaos. Gunshots. Shouting. A blur of motion. Charlotte dropped to the ground, her body hitting the cold pavement. The world around her exploded in noise, in fire. She could feel the heat, the impact, the chaos. The gun pressed harder into her temple, but she could barely register it. All she knew was the sound of her pulse. Louder than the shots. The sound of her breath, ragged and desperate. And then, silence. Everything stopped. For one fleeting moment, it was over. But then, the silence was shattered. A figure loomed over her, blocking out the dim light. Charlotte's chest heaved with every breath, each one a struggle. Her body felt heavy, the weight of fear pressing her down. The figure moved closer. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs felt like lead. The gun was still at her temple, cold against her skin. She could hear footsteps, rapid, muffled by the chaos. The leader's voice sliced through the tension. "Get her up," he ordered. Hands gripped her arms, pulling her to her feet. Her vision blurred, disoriented. The car was gone. The alley seemed even darker now. Charlotte's mind raced. Where was everyone? Who was still alive? The noise of the gunfire lingered in her ears, the ringing still there, faint but persistent. A laugh broke through the thick air. Cold. Mocking. Charlotte's eyes snapped up. The man who'd been holding her, he wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes were locked on something else. Something behind her. Her pulse quickened. Was it more people? A trap? She didn't dare move. Her throat was dry, but she swallowed anyway. And then, a flash of light. A new car. Racing toward them from the far end of the alley. The headlights cut through the darkness, sharp and blinding. The men stiffened. The leader's hand twitched at his side. The car screeched to a halt. The door flung open. A silhouette emerged. A man in a dark coat. His face hidden, but his presence undeniable. Charlotte's body tensed even more. Her mind screamed, "Stay still, stay quiet." The figure moved closer, his footsteps confident, deliberate. He stopped just short of them, studying the group. The leader stepped forward. The air was thick with tension. "Is it done?" the man in the dark coat asked, his voice calm, steady. For a second, Charlotte thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The leader hesitated. Something passed between them. An unspoken understanding. Then, the man in the coat glanced at Charlotte. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and calculating. "She's a liability," he muttered under his breath. Charlotte's heart skipped. Liability? Her stomach twisted. She could barely breathe. Was this it? Was this how it ended? The leader nodded slowly. But then, the man in the dark coat turned back to the others. His voice was barely a whisper, but Charlotte heard it all the same. "Deal with it." Her body stiffened. This was not the plan. Nothing about this was part of the plan. And then, the world around her tilted. Her knees buckled. The ground was too close, too fast. And then, darkness. Everything was black. Silent. Still. Charlotte felt the weight of nothingness press down on her, suffocating. Her body was numb, her mind spinning. Her fingers twitched, her eyelids fluttered. She could barely hear her own breath. Then a sound. Soft at first, like a distant echo. A voice. Barely a whisper, but clear enough to rattle her. "Wake up." Her eyes snapped open. She was lying on a cold, damp floor. Her head throbbed, and her mouth tasted like metal. She blinked, trying to focus. The room was small, a concrete box with no windows. The walls were bare, cracked in places, the faint smell of mildew in the air. Her wrists were bound tightly, behind her back. Her legs, no, they weren't bound, but they felt weak, like they wouldn't hold her. The realization hit her like a wave. She was alone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to sit up. Every movement felt like a struggle. Her hands were raw, the ropes biting into her skin. She shifted, wincing as her body screamed in protest. "Don't move too fast." The voice came again, closer this time. Charlotte's pulse raced. She twisted her head, searching for the source. There, in the corner of the room, stood a figure. Dark, almost blending into the shadows. The man in the coat. The same cold eyes. The same detached expression. He stepped forward slowly. Charlotte's breath hitched. Her mind was working furiously, piecing together fragments. Who was he? What did he want with her? His voice was calm, almost soothing, in the thick silence of the room. You're awake. Good. She swallowed hard, the dry feeling in her throat making her gag. Where am I? She asked, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, the click of his boots echoing in the confined space. Charlotte's breath quickened. What do you want from me? Her voice shook, but she fought to keep it steady. He smiled, a cold, knowing smile. You really don't understand, do you? His voice was low, mocking. I don't need anything from you. Charlotte froze. Her mind was whirling. What does that mean? She asked, confused, desperate for clarity. His smile deepened. It means you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, Charlotte. Her pulse quickened again. A chill ran down her spine. What was he talking about? The room felt smaller now, as if it was closing in on her. He moved even closer, his shadow casting over her. And then, with a quick motion, he knelt beside her. His hand reached out. Charlotte jerked back, but the man was faster. His fingers brushed against her cheek, cold and deliberate. The touch sent a shiver through her. You should be more careful about who you trust, he murmured, his voice low. Because some people are already dead by the time they realize they've been betrayed. Charlotte's heart stopped. Betrayed? Her mind went back to the alley, to the figures that surrounded her. To the car that had arrived so suddenly. To the package she'd failed to deliver. The man stood up, towering over her now. His gaze never left her. That package, he said, pausing for effect, was never meant for you. Her breath caught in her throat. What did that mean? Who was she working for? Charlotte tried to process his words, but before she could speak, he turned away. His footsteps echoed in the empty room. Don't waste your energy trying to escape, he called over his shoulder. You won't get far. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the walls closing in. The silence in the room felt suffocating now, heavier than before. Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest, each beat a reminder of the danger she was in. Her thoughts scattered like shards of glass. What had he meant? The package was never meant for her. Who had sent her on this mission? Her mind grasped at the fragments, trying to make sense of it all. But the more she tried, the more everything slipped away. Her throat burned with desperation. She had no one to trust. No one but herself. But how could she escape this? The ropes. The cold. Her limbs still felt like jelly, shaky, unresponsive. Charlotte shifted her weight, testing the strength of the bonds. They were tight, too tight. She gritted her teeth against the sharp pain as she tugged at the rope with her bound wrists. No use. She was trapped. Her eyes scanned the room again, taking in the walls, the door. Nothing. No windows, no way out. A door, thick and metal, with no handle. Her mind raced. Her fingers ached, still trying to loosen the knots that held her. The cold cement floor beneath her felt like it was pressing against her skin, willing her to give up. But she couldn't. Not now. Not when the only thing standing between her and survival was time. Then she heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible at first. Footsteps. Slow. Methodical. They were coming closer. Charlotte froze, her body tense with fear. Her head whipped toward the door, her heart in her throat. The footsteps stopped. A long pause. Too long. She could almost hear the breath of whoever stood on the other side. She held her own breath, the air thick in her lungs. The handle jiggled. A soft creak echoed through the room. The door opened just a crack. A shadow stepped into the doorway. A different figure this time. Not the man in the coat. A woman. She was tall, with dark, angular features. Her eyes were sharp, almost predatory as they locked onto Charlotte. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Charlotte couldn't look away. There was something about her, something cold, calculating. The woman stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind her. She didn't make a sound as she walked toward Charlotte. Charlotte's mind raced. What did she want? Was she going to kill her too? The woman crouched down slowly, her movements deliberate. Her fingers brushed against Charlotte's bound wrists, and Charlotte flinched, the touch unexpected. "Who are you?" Charlotte's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but the woman heard her. Her lips curved into a tight, almost amused smile. "Not important," she said softly. Her voice was chillingly calm, as though they were discussing something trivial. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. The woman studied her for a long moment, eyes glinting with something darker. "I'm here to offer you a choice," she said, her voice low and full of intent. A choice? Charlotte's mind tried to grasp the meaning of her words. What could she possibly offer? "What choice?" she rasped. The woman leaned in closer, her breath cool against Charlotte's ear. "The package. You still think it's about that. But it's not." Charlotte's pulse quickened. What did she mean? The woman straightened up and stepped back, her gaze lingering on Charlotte for just a moment longer. "If you want to walk out of here alive," she continued, "you'll have to make a decision." Charlotte's head swam. Walk out of here alive. Alive? She could feel the weight of those words, the implication. Her eyes searched the woman's face, trying to read her, to understand the game she was playing. "Why are you helping me?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the door. The footsteps outside were growing louder now. She looked back at Charlotte, her expression unreadable. "Because you still have value," she said. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. Still have value? What did that mean? Before Charlotte could speak, the woman straightened, her hand brushing against the cold door frame. "Stay quiet," she warned, glancing over her shoulder. "And don't try anything stupid." And then, just like that, she was gone. The room was once again silent. Charlotte was left alone with nothing but her racing thoughts, the weight of the woman's words pressing down on her chest. What had she meant by value? And who was she really working for? The door creaked open once more, but this time, it wasn't the woman who entered. It was someone much worse. The door swung open with a harsh screech, cutting through the silence like a knife. Charlotte's heart skipped, her breath catching in her throat. The figure that stepped inside was tall, broad-shouldered, with the heavy presence of someone who carried authority and violence. The man who walked through the door wasn't like the others. He didn't just fill the room with his presence. He owned it. His eyes were dark, unforgiving, and they locked onto Charlotte's immediately. For a moment, they stared at each other, the weight of the silence oppressive. Then, he spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You've been quite the problem, Charlotte." The words hit her like a slap. Problem? She could feel the anger in his tone, could see the way his muscles coiled beneath his clothes. He wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to negotiate. And she knew it. He took a slow step toward her, his boots clicking against the concrete, sending a shiver down her spine. She tried to remain still, tried to control the panic building inside her. Who are you?" she managed to say, though her voice trembled. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched down in front of her, his gaze piercing. The proximity was suffocating. She could feel his breath on her skin, cold and menacing. "Does it matter?" he asked, his voice cold, almost amused by her question. Charlotte swallowed hard, her mind racing. She knew she had to get out of here. She had to think fast, but her limbs were still weak, her senses dulled from the shock, the uncertainty. "Please, just let me go," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned in closer, and Charlotte's stomach twisted in fear. "Let you go," he repeated, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "You really don't understand, do you?" His hand reached out suddenly, grabbing a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back with brutal force. Pain shot through her scalp as she gasped, her whole body tensing. "No," he said softly, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're not in a position to make demands." Charlotte's mind raced. She couldn't let him break her. She had to stay strong. But how? Her body was too weak. The ropes still dug into her wrists, and there was nowhere to go. He looked at her for a long moment, his fingers tightening in her hair, his grip like iron. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Charlotte," he said, almost to himself. "But you'll learn." Before she could react, he released his grip on her hair and stood up, stepping back. The pain from her scalp lingered, a raw reminder of his power. Then, with a sharp movement, he pulled a gun from his waistband and pointed it directly at her face. Charlotte's breath hitched. Everything around her seemed to freeze. The barrel of the gun was dark, menacing, and it felt like it was the only thing in the room. Her pulse hammered in her ears. For a moment, she was certain this was it. That there would be no more chances, no more escapes. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Charlotte could barely manage a nod. She didn't know exactly why she was here, but she could guess. She had crossed the wrong people. She had failed to deliver. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You're expendable," he said, as if the words were nothing more than a casual observation. "And that makes you dangerous." Dangerous? Her mind raced. What did that mean? Why would she be dangerous now? The man stepped closer again, his eyes never leaving hers. He seemed to savor the moment, the terror in her eyes, the way her breath quickened with each passing second. Charlotte's whole body was on edge. She could feel the tension building in the room, thick and suffocating. And then, just as quickly, the gun lowered. She blinked, not sure whether to be relieved or more terrified. "I won't kill you," he said, as though making a decision on a whim. "Not yet." Charlotte's heart fluttered in her chest. What did that mean? Why had he spared her? But she didn't have time to think about it. The man moved behind her, his hands moving quickly to untie the ropes that bound her wrists. Charlotte tensed, instinctively trying to pull away, but it was no use. He was too strong, too fast. The ropes fell away, and she rubbed her raw wrists, trying to regain some feeling. "You'll do something for me," the man said, his voice low, almost a growl. Charlotte's eyes narrowed, her body still aching from the treatment she'd received. "Do something?" she repeated, her voice hoarse. "Yes," he replied, his eyes dark. "There's still a job left for you to finish. A job that's far more important than anything you've done up until now." Her stomach churned at his words. She had failed once already. What could he possibly want from her now? He stepped in front of her, locking eyes with her again, his presence suffocating. "You'll do it. Or I'll make sure you regret it." Charlotte's mind raced. What choice did she really have? No one was coming to save her. And if she refused, there was only one way this could end. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to break. The man smiled, a dark, triumphant smile. "I knew you'd come around." And in that moment, Charlotte understood the truth. Her survival depended on playing a dangerous game. And she was about to enter the lion's den. The man's smile twisted, like a predator savoring its catch. "Good," he said, his voice cold with satisfaction. Charlotte's heart thudded in her chest, but she kept her expression blank. She wasn't about to show weakness now. Her body was still sore, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her sharp. The man turned away from her, moving toward the door. "You've got 1 hour," he said over his shoulder. Charlotte's stomach sank. 1 hour? What kind of deadline was that? She couldn't afford to waste any time. She had to figure out what he wanted from her, and more importantly, how to get out of here alive. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Charlotte alone in the dim, concrete room. She quickly moved to her feet, testing her limbs. Her legs were shaky, but they would hold. Her wrists still burned, the skin raw from the ropes, but she didn't care about the pain. She had to think. What was the job he wanted her to do? Her mind raced, but it was hard to focus with the uncertainty choking her. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. She scanned the walls for any potential escape routes, but there was nothing. Just the same cracked concrete, the low hum of fluorescent lights above, and the echo of her own rapid breathing. Time was running out. She had to act fast. Charlotte's eyes flickered toward the door. It was sturdy, reinforced, no handle on her side. She couldn't break through that on her own. Her gaze shifted to the small metal table near the corner of the room. On it were some tools, a few scattered papers, and what looked like a map. She didn't have time to study the map yet. But the tools. She could work with that. Charlotte crossed the room quickly, her steps light, avoiding any unnecessary noise. Her fingers brushed over the items on the table. A pair of pliers, a wrench, a few pens. Nothing that could be of immediate use for escaping, but she couldn't leave them behind. She grabbed the pliers and tucked them into her jacket pocket, praying they wouldn't be found when she was searched. It was a small move, but it could mean the difference between life and death. She returned to the door, pressing her ear to it, trying to hear if anyone was outside. All she could hear was the muffled hum of the fluorescent lights. No footsteps. No voices. Yet, she knew better than to assume she was alone. She could feel their eyes on her, even if she couldn't see them. The sound of her breath filled her ears. Suddenly, she heard it. A faint sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't waste any more time. In the dim light, she moved to the corner of the room, out of sight from the door. She crouched low, pressing herself against the cold wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her fingers tightened around the pliers, her knuckles white. Every sound outside the door sent a jolt of fear through her, but she forced herself to remain still, silent. The footsteps stopped. Then, the sound of keys. The door handle rattled. The lock clicked. Her breath caught in her throat. It opened. The man in the dark coat stepped inside again, his eyes scanning the room. Charlotte barely dared to breathe. His gaze swept past her, not noticing her crouched in the corner. She remained frozen, her body tense with the threat of discovery. He took a few more steps, then paused. For a brief moment, Charlotte thought he could hear her. But no. He turned back toward the door, his silhouette framed by the weak light from the hallway. "You have 30 minutes," he said flatly, his voice cool and emotionless. "Make sure it's done." And with that, he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Charlotte in an oppressive silence once again. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound nearly deafening. 30 minutes. She had 30 minutes to figure this out. To figure out what he wanted her to do. And to survive. Charlotte's mind was spinning. The weight of the situation threatened to crush her, but she knew she couldn't afford to let fear take control. She had to be sharp. She had to keep moving. Now was the time to figure out who she was truly dealing with, and why they thought she had value. Her eyes darted to the map on the table. Maybe that was the key. Maybe the map held answers. With a steadying breath, she crossed the room once more, her hands shaking as she picked up the map. Unfolding it, she squinted, trying to make sense of the markings. She recognized a few places, the city streets, the outskirts, and a small warehouse near the docks. But there was a red circle drawn around one location. A place she hadn't seen before. Her stomach twisted as her finger traced the circle. A drop-off point. Her mind clicked into gear. This was it. This was what they wanted from her. Charlotte's heart raced. She had to get there, had to make the delivery. But she also knew one thing for sure now. She wasn't going there alone. There was more at play here than just her survival. The game was much bigger than that. And Charlotte had just become a pawn in it. The map trembled in Charlotte's hands as the full weight of the situation settled over her. The circle on the map wasn't just a drop-off point. It was a trap. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to break free and get as far away from this madness as possible. But she knew that wasn't an option anymore. They'd already made it clear, she didn't have a choice. She had to deliver the package. The circle on the map, it was no coincidence. Someone, somewhere, was watching her every move, waiting for her to complete the job they'd set in motion. Charlotte's fingers traced the edges of the map, the sharp lines of the city streets, her mind spinning faster than her hands could move. She needed to act fast. She couldn't let them control her anymore. With the pliers still tucked in her pocket, Charlotte hurriedly scanned the room for anything else that might give her an edge. A small desk sat in the corner, its drawer slightly ajar. She slid her fingers into the crack, heart pounding as she pulled it open, the faint scent of old wood filling the air. Inside, there was nothing but a few pens, some scraps of paper, and a worn leather notebook. Charlotte's fingers closed around the notebook, and she flipped it open, scanning the pages quickly. It was filled with notes, names, addresses, orders. And then she saw it. Her name. Her eyes narrowed. Next to her name was a string of numbers, a code. She read the line again, a shiver running down her spine. This wasn't just about the package. This was personal. The numbers were a countdown. A countdown to something she couldn't afford to ignore. The clock was ticking, and it was closing in on her. A strange, guttural laugh escaped her lips, more from disbelief than amusement. Of course, they weren't just going to let her walk away. There were too many layers to this game, and Charlotte had just scratched the surface. The sound of footsteps outside the door jolted her back to the present. Her pulse quickened. Time was running out. She shoved the notebook into the back of her jacket, trying to keep calm. The last thing she needed was someone catching her off guard. She moved quickly to the map again, her eyes flicking to the circle, then to the clock on the wall. The minute hand was moving closer to the deadline. She had only 20 minutes left. The sound of keys rattling at the door made her freeze. She took a deep breath, wiping her clammy hands on her jeans. The door swung open, and the man in the dark coat stepped inside again, his expression unreadable. "You ready?" he asked, his voice smooth, but there was something colder in it this time. Something more calculating. Charlotte didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at him with forced indifference, masking the fear simmering beneath her skin. She wasn't about to let him see how much she was struggling. She had no idea what he wanted her to do next, but she would play along, at least for now. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady, even though her insides were screaming. "I'm ready." His eyes narrowed, a look of suspicion flashing across his face. He didn't believe her. "You don't look ready," he observed, his gaze sweeping over her. Charlotte held her breath, waiting for him to press further. But he didn't. He didn't need to. He was testing her, testing if she would crack. "Let's go," he said finally, his voice cold, and then he motioned for her to follow. The door swung open, and Charlotte took a step toward it, her heart hammering in her chest. Every part of her wanted to fight, wanted to resist. But she couldn't afford to show any weakness. Not now. The man in the coat turned his back, and Charlotte had no choice but to follow him down the narrow corridor. Her feet felt heavy, but she kept her pace steady, walking like she had no care in the world. They passed a few other rooms, empty, silent, like they were part of a bigger operation, one that Charlotte was only beginning to understand. She had no idea what would happen once they reached the drop-off point. Would it be another trap? Or would she be left with the consequences of failure? Her mind raced, but there was no time to make a plan. She had no choice but to keep moving forward. They reached a steel door at the end of the corridor. The man in the coat stopped, turning to her. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low. Charlotte nodded, her heart pounding, as he pushed open the door. It was dark on the other side, but she could see the faint outline of a vehicle parked just a few feet away, its headlights off but still casting long shadows. The engine was running. Charlotte's throat went dry. Who was in that car? The man in the coat stepped forward, leading her toward the vehicle, his posture rigid, purposeful. And then, as if they were going to meet someone, he paused, glancing over his shoulder at Charlotte. "You've been given a second chance," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "Don't waste it." Charlotte didn't respond. She couldn't afford to speak. Not now. Her mind was working a mile a minute, weighing her options. The car door creaked open. A figure stepped out. Her breath hitched. It was a woman. She was tall, with dark hair, wearing a suit that looked far too expensive for this place. The woman's eyes met Charlotte's, piercing, calculating. And Charlotte knew, without a doubt, this wasn't just a delivery anymore. This was a reckoning. And she was about to be caught in the middle of it. The woman's gaze was unwavering, as though she could see right through Charlotte. It sent a chill racing down her spine. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete, each step measured, deliberate. There was something in the way she moved, too calm, too controlled. Charlotte's pulse quickened. This wasn't the kind of person you crossed. The woman was an apex predator in a world where survival meant obeying the rules, and Charlotte had just been handed a new one. The man in the coat nodded slightly, acknowledging the woman's presence without a word, before stepping back, disappearing into the shadows as if he were nothing more than a figment of the night. Charlotte was left standing there, exposed, facing the woman who was now eyeing her like a piece of meat. "You're Charlotte Lindström," the woman said, her voice cool but laced with an edge that Charlotte couldn't ignore. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Charlotte didn't respond immediately, her throat tight. She couldn't afford to say the wrong thing. Instead, she nodded, her hands tucked deep into her jacket pockets to hide the shaking of her fingers. "That's right," Charlotte finally said, forcing the words out with as much confidence as she could muster. The woman's lips curved into a thin smile, but there was nothing warm about it. "I think you know why you're here," the woman continued, her eyes narrowing as she studied Charlotte. Charlotte didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was spinning. What did this woman know? What game was she playing? The woman took a step closer, her heels clicking again, the noise like an ominous drumbeat. Charlotte's heart slammed in her chest. "You don't have to be afraid, Charlotte," the woman said, her voice almost too smooth, like she was trying to calm a wild animal. "I'm not here to hurt you. Yet." The word yet hung in the air, pregnant with meaning. Charlotte's breath caught. Yet? What the hell was this about? The woman stopped in front of her, her gaze never wavering. Then, without warning, she reached into her suit jacket, pulling out a small envelope and holding it out to Charlotte. "Take it," the woman ordered, her voice crisp. Charlotte hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the envelope, before she took it from the woman's hand. She didn't know why, but she opened it right then and there. Inside was a photograph. A single image. A photograph of a man. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. It was a face she recognized. A face from her past. It was Eric, the man who had been her partner in this operation. The same man who had disappeared without a trace weeks ago after their last failed job. Her pulse raced. What was this? The woman's voice cut through her thoughts. "Your friend Eric," she said with a casualness that made Charlotte's skin crawl. "He's been very uncooperative. But we've taken care of him." Charlotte's hands clenched into fists, the paper crinkling under her grip. Eric. They had him. "Why are you showing me this?" Charlotte managed, her voice shaking but steady. She forced herself to look at the woman, despite the wave of panic threatening to drown her. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Because you're going to help us," she replied, her voice cold and final. "Help you?" Charlotte repeated, her stomach twisting. "With what?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she motioned toward the car behind her, the dark windows reflecting the dim streetlights. The door clicked open, and another man stepped out. He was tall, with rough features and a stare that could cut through steel. He didn't speak a word. Just stood there, silently watching Charlotte. The woman turned back to Charlotte, her gaze unwavering. "You're going to find something for us, something very valuable," she said, her voice low, but there was an edge to it now. A subtle threat. Charlotte's heart dropped. "Find something? What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quieter now, laced with fear. The woman stepped closer, the smile never leaving her lips. You'll figure it out. It's the only way you'll get Eric back. Charlotte's stomach turned. Get Eric back? It was a game of leverage, one she wasn't sure she was ready to play. The photo of Eric. The knowledge that they held him as collateral. It was all a twisted puzzle, and Charlotte was trapped in the middle of it. Her mind raced with questions, but the woman wasn't interested in answers, only compliance. Don't waste our time, the woman said sharply. You know what happens to people who waste time. Charlotte swallowed hard, her throat dry. It was a threat, plain and simple. And it was clear, if she didn't play along, they would dispose of her, or worse. Charlotte's hand clenched around the photograph, her eyes staring at Eric's face, as if looking for a way out. The woman took another step back, giving Charlotte space to breathe, but there was no reprieve in her expression. Go ahead, the woman said softly. I'll be waiting. We all will. She motioned toward the car again. The tall man nodded, the silent enforcer standing guard. Charlotte glanced at the vehicle, the weight of the photo heavy in her hand. She had no choice. If she wanted to see Eric again, she had to do whatever they wanted. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she had no other options. Charlotte nodded slowly, a cold determination settling into her bones. Fine, she said, her voice steadier now. I'll do it. The woman's smile widened, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. Good girl, she said, her voice dripping with malice. Charlotte turned toward the car, every step feeling like it could be her last. And as the door slammed shut behind her, she knew one thing for sure. The game had just begun. The car's engine roared to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Charlotte sat in the back, her hands gripping the seat, her mind reeling. The air was thick with tension, the faint hum of the engine doing little to calm her nerves. The man in the front seat didn't speak. He was silent, stoic, an enforcer, a shadow in the night. Charlotte stared out the window, watching the streets blur by. Her heart raced. Every street, every turn felt like it was leading her further into the unknown. What was it they wanted her to find? What was so important that it had to be hidden, buried deep in the city? And how could she possibly retrieve it when she didn't even know what it was? Her fingers tightened around the envelope, still clutched in her hand, the photograph of Eric burning into her mind. She had to focus. She couldn't afford to let panic take control. Not now. The woman's words echoed in her ears, asterisk. You'll figure it out. It's the only way you'll get Eric back. Asterisk. That promise, if you could even call it that, was both a lifeline and a death sentence. Charlotte's thoughts flickered back to Eric. She had no idea where he was, what condition he was in, but she knew that if she didn't do this right, she'd never see him again. She had to trust the woman's words. She had to do whatever it took. The car slowed, and Charlotte was snapped out of her spiraling thoughts. Her eyes darted forward, catching a glimpse of a dimly lit building up ahead. The car pulled into a narrow alley, the tires scraping the cracked pavement. The enforcer put the car in park, but didn't turn the engine off. For a long moment he didn't move. Charlotte could hear the sound of his breathing, steady, controlled. Then, he finally turned to face her. Get out, he said, his voice low. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. This was it. She glanced out the window. The building before her was a warehouse, old and unmarked. No lights. No signs. It was completely off the grid. She had no idea what was inside, but everything about it screamed danger. She stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of every second pressing down on her. The enforcer followed her, his footsteps silent behind her. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare show any sign of weakness. She had no idea what kind of hell she was walking into, but she couldn't let herself break. Not yet. The door to the warehouse creaked open in front of her, and the smell of rust and decay hit her immediately. The place was cold. Too cold. There was a faint, flickering light at the far end of the room. It cast long shadows across the floor, making it impossible to see much. Charlotte's senses were on high alert as she walked deeper into the darkness. Behind her, the enforcer moved silently, like a shadow. She could feel his presence, close enough to touch. "Wait here," he ordered, his voice sharp. Charlotte paused, turning slightly to glance at him. He was already heading towards the back of the room, disappearing into the shadows. She took a few shallow breaths, trying to steady herself. The air was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and metal, and something far less familiar, something metallic. Her skin prickled with unease. From the corner of her eye, Charlotte caught the glint of something. She turned her head to see what it was, her heart leaping in her chest. A small metal table stood in the center of the room, covered with tools, knives, wires, and what looked like an old, rusted lockbox. Her eyes narrowed. There was something wrong here. Something more than just the package she was supposed to retrieve. Her pulse quickened as she stepped closer to the table, the clinking sound of the enforcer's boots growing fainter as he disappeared further into the back. Charlotte couldn't help herself. She reached for the lockbox. Her fingers trembled as she tried to pry it open, the cold metal digging into her skin. It was locked. Of course it was. But there was something inside that she needed to see. And before she could think twice, she grabbed one of the tools from the table, a rusty pair of pliers, and began working on the lock. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each second feeling like an eternity. The metal squealed in protest as she twisted, pulling at it with all her strength. Finally, *click star. The lock gave way. Her fingers darted to open the box. Inside, there was a file. A manila folder, thick with papers, hidden under a pile of tattered fabric. Charlotte's hands froze. There was no going back now. She carefully pulled the folder out, her heart hammering as she opened it, the papers inside crackling in her hands. The first page had a name on it. Her name. And Eric's. Complete list of operations. Her breath caught in her throat. The papers outlined the entire operation, the drugs, the distribution networks, the people involved. There were names of powerful figures, men and women who controlled parts of the city Charlotte had only ever heard of in whispers. This was bigger than she ever realized. She wasn't just dealing with street-level thugs. This was a syndicate. A powerful network. Charlotte flipped through the pages, her hands shaking, until she saw a photograph, another face she recognized. It was the woman from earlier. Her face was right there, in the files, listed as the ringleader of the operation. Charlotte's mind raced. The woman wasn't just pulling the strings. She was the one who controlled everything. And Charlotte had just stumbled into the heart of a much darker world than she ever expected. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Charlotte slammed the folder shut, hiding it under the table. She turned, but it was too late. The enforcer was already there, standing just a few feet away, watching her. The coldness in his eyes was unmistakable. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked, his voice low. Charlotte didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands were still shaking, her mind spinning, and her instincts were screaming that it was time to run. But she couldn't run. Not now. The game had already changed. The enforcer took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. The tension between them hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating any chance of escape. Charlotte's pulse pounded in her ears, the silence stretching out as if everything had slowed down. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each one feeling more forced than the last. She tried to keep her hands steady, but the trembling was impossible to hide. She could feel the weight of the folder pressing against her side, the cold paper sharp against her ribs. The enforcer didn't speak for a long moment. He just stood there, watching her, as though he could read her every thought. Then, finally, his lips curled into a small, dangerous smile. "You're not as clever as you think, Charlotte," he said, his voice like gravel. "You should have kept your hands off things that don't concern you." Charlotte didn't move. She couldn't. She wasn't sure what to say, but she was certain of one thing. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't even about Eric. It was about something much bigger, and now she was trapped in the middle of it. The enforcer took another step forward, the sound of his boots echoing off the concrete floor. Charlotte's eyes darted to the door. It was too far. She couldn't outrun him. She had to think. Fast. She glanced down at the pliers still gripped in her hand. No. She couldn't fight him. Not physically. She was outmatched, outclassed. But the file. The file had to mean something. The woman's face, the names, the network. This was leverage. Please! Charlotte finally managed to speak, her voice low but steady. You don't understand. I'm just trying to survive here. I don't know what's going on, but I'll. Stop. The enforcer cut her off, his voice cold and final. He took another step, closing the distance between them, his hand outstretched. Give me the file, he ordered, his tone sharp. Charlotte hesitated, her heart racing, but she knew it was a lost cause. If she didn't hand it over now, she would never get another chance. With a shaky hand, she pulled the file from under the table and extended it toward him. He snatched it from her with brutal efficiency, flipping through the pages without a second glance. Charlotte watched him, her mind frantically trying to make sense of everything. Why had she been brought here? Why had they made her part of this twisted web? The enforcer paused, his eyes flicking over a particular page. Charlotte's breath caught. It was the woman's face again, the one who had sent her here. But this time, there was more. A list of codes. Names. Addresses. And a date. The enforcer's lips thinned as he studied it, his jaw tightening. Charlotte couldn't help herself. She took a tentative step closer, but his steely gaze made her stop in her tracks. You don't need to see this, he growled. It's not for you. She swallowed, but curiosity gnawed at her. You work for her, Charlotte blurted out before she could stop herself. Don't you? The woman who? The enforcer's gaze flicked to her, and the air seemed to freeze. You talk too much, he said, his voice suddenly low and menacing. Charlotte's throat tightened. Before she could react, the enforcer took a step back, the file still in his hands. You think you can just walk away with this? He asked, his tone dangerously calm. You think you can just leave with all the answers? Charlotte's stomach dropped. Answers? She hadn't even begun to understand the question. No, she said, almost to herself. I didn't mean to get involved. I don't. You're already in it. His voice was cutting, his words final. You don't get to back out now. Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest, and for the first time since she'd entered the warehouse, fear began to claw at her. The enforcer took another step back, then turned without a word, walking toward the back of the room where shadows swallowed him whole. Charlotte felt a momentary flicker of hope. Maybe she could leave now, maybe she could get out while he wasn't looking. But just as she moved, the sound of the door slamming open echoed through the space, making her freeze. A new voice. Is she the one? Charlotte's head snapped toward the doorway. A man stood there, his figure tall and imposing, his face partially obscured by the low lighting. He wore a tailored suit, the kind that spoke of power. Of danger. His eyes, dark and calculating, swept over her with a cold intensity. The enforcer didn't flinch. Yes. She's the one. The new man stepped forward, his gaze locked on Charlotte. Bring her here, he ordered, his voice low and controlled. Charlotte's body tensed as the enforcer grabbed her by the arm, pulling her toward the man. She tried to resist, but his grip was ironclad. The man looked down at her with a detached amusement. I suppose you think this is all some kind of accident, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Charlotte's eyes flickered between him and the enforcer, her pulse racing. I don't know what's going on, she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. I'm just trying to get out of here alive. The man's lips curled into a small, cruel smile. Trying to survive? He raised an eyebrow. You've already chosen your side, Charlotte. There's no going back now. Charlotte opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. No, the man continued, his voice darkening. Let's see how well you do when you're truly in the game. And with that, everything she thought she understood began to crumble. Charlotte's mind raced. The man's words hung in the air like an iron weight, pressing down on her chest. There's no going back now. She was trapped, no matter how she spun it. The doors, the windows, they might as well have been sealed shut. This was a place of no escape. The man's cold eyes studied her as the enforcer pushed her forward, his grip tightening around her arm. She tried to shake him off, but he didn't budge. The new man's presence felt suffocating. There was something unnerving about him, a quiet power, like a predator waiting for its prey to make the first move. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking on the cold concrete floor. Charlotte's breath hitched. "You're going to help us," he said, his voice smooth, but laced with an undercurrent of menace. Charlotte swallowed hard. "Help you?" His lips curled in amusement. "You're smarter than that, Charlotte. You know exactly what I mean." Her mind raced, trying to piece it all together, but it felt like too much, too fast. The woman who had sent her here, Eric's disappearance, the photograph, the file, it was all a tangled mess she couldn't untangle. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What was left to say? The man's eyes darkened. He could see her uncertainty, her hesitation, and it only seemed to fuel his amusement. "That's the problem with people like you," he continued, his voice almost pitying. "You think you have control. You think you have a choice. But you don't. You never did." Charlotte's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but her mind was still spinning. The file. The codes. The woman. It was too much. Too many pieces scattered around her, all pointing to something darker than she could comprehend. "Why me?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why am I involved in this?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the enforcer, his silent companion in all of this. The enforcer stepped forward, closing the distance between Charlotte and the man, his hands resting at his sides, but there was something in his posture, something watchful, predatory. "She's the last one," the enforcer said, his voice flat, almost bored. "She's the last piece of the puzzle. If she doesn't do what she's told, things will get messy." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "Messy?" The man's gaze flicked back to Charlotte, as if he was enjoying the fear in her eyes. "You've already been marked, Charlotte. You're already in our network. You don't have the luxury of walking away now." Her heart was pounding in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak again, but the words were lost. The gravity of what he was saying, the finality in his voice, it was suffocating. The man took another step closer, his eyes boring into hers. "You see," he said, his voice turning dark and calculating, "you've been involved in something far bigger than you ever realized. You've been on the periphery, but now, you're at the center of it all." Charlotte's mind raced. She didn't understand. She didn't want to understand. "I don't know anything about any of this," she managed, her voice cracking slightly. I was just trying to survive." The man chuckled softly, a sound devoid of warmth. "Survival. That's what you all say. And yet, here you are, tangled up in a game you can't win." The enforcer took a step forward, reaching into his jacket, his fingers brushing against something hidden within. Charlotte's breath caught. He pulled out a small device, a phone, its screen cracked, with a single, familiar image glowing on the display. It was a photo of Eric. Charlotte's stomach lurched. The man had a hold of Eric. She was sure of it now. The man looked at the phone, then back at Charlotte, his expression unreadable. "Eric's fate is in your hands," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "The moment you took that package, you sealed your fate. Now you have a choice: help us, and we might spare him. Refuse and—" He didn't finish. The silence that followed was enough. Charlotte's hands shook as she stared at the photo of Eric, his face frozen in that moment of fear, that same fear she had seen in her own reflection earlier. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She had to act. There was no time to waste. Eric's life, her own life, was hanging in the balance. But what were they asking her to do? What was it that could force someone to take such a dark path? The man wasn't done. We need you to infiltrate, he continued, his voice low, dangerous. There's a man, a target. Someone we need gone. He's a problem, and you're going to solve it for us. Charlotte's mind spun again. A target? Who? I don't even know who you're talking about, she protested, her voice rising in desperation. The man didn't flinch. He took a step closer. You'll know him soon enough. And you'll do what we tell you. Or Eric pays the price. Charlotte's eyes darted to the enforcer, then back to the man. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now. She was suffocating. Do you want to see what happens if you refuse? The man asked quietly. Charlotte froze. The enforcer stepped forward, pulling out another phone. This one had a video playing, but the image was blurry, just a dark, grainy figure. It was Eric. Tied up. Worse than she could have imagined. Charlotte's breath hitched, her knees almost giving out beneath her. This was real. They weren't bluffing. You see, Charlotte, the man said, his voice low, almost gentle. You're part of something much bigger than yourself. And the sooner you accept that, the easier it'll be. Charlotte's mouth was dry, her body trembling, but her mind was screaming. She was at the edge, staring into a dark abyss, and she didn't know how to climb back out. She couldn't lose Eric. She couldn't lose herself. And yet, every instinct told her that agreeing to this would be the end of everything she knew. She was caught in their web. But there was no turning back now. She had made her choice. Fine, she said, her voice barely audible. I'll do it. I'll help you. The man smiled, his eyes cold, satisfied. Good girl, he said softly. And just like that, Charlotte was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was now a player in a game with rules she didn't understand, and the consequences would be more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest as she stood there, her body numb, her mind racing. The man's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, but the moment she agreed to help, something inside her died. It wasn't relief. It wasn't even fear. It was the crushing realization that she was now one of them. A piece on their board. And there was no going back. The enforcer moved toward her, his steps deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. She could feel his presence looming behind her, heavy and suffocating. Good, the man said, breaking the silence. You'll find out everything you need to know soon enough. But first... He paused, his eyes narrowing. First, we make sure you're properly equipped. The enforcer stepped forward, producing a small black case, its sleek surface gleaming under the harsh lights. Charlotte's stomach twisted, the pit of dread deepening. The man nodded to the enforcer, who opened the case with practiced ease. Inside was a weapon, a small, compact handgun, cold and deadly. Charlotte froze. Take it, the man said, his voice cool but firm. The enforcer placed the gun in Charlotte's hand, his fingers brushing against hers. The metal felt foreign, alien in her grip. It was weighty, too heavy for her to carry without feeling the full weight of the choice she just made. I'm not going to use this, Charlotte said, her voice shaking. I don't know how. The man smiled, the kind of smile that made her stomach flip. You don't need to know how, Charlotte. You'll learn. You'll be trained. You're not going in blind. But there's one rule you need to understand. Charlotte's eyes flicked to the enforcer, who stood silently at the back of the room, his face expressionless. Once you step into this world, the man continued, his voice low, there is no leaving. No second chances. Charlotte's mind whirled. The man's words sank deep into her soul, but there was a larger truth she had to face. She had crossed the line. She couldn't turn back. Not after what she had seen. Not after what she had heard. Eric's life was still in the balance. She had no choice. The man turned to the enforcer. Show her the way. The enforcer stepped forward, his movements calculated and precise. He didn't speak, but Charlotte could feel his gaze on her, cold and unyielding. He led her toward the exit, the heavy door creaking open as if to invite her into a world she didn't belong in. Charlotte's mind raced as she followed, the weight of the gun in her hand a constant reminder of the choices she'd made. The world outside the warehouse was nothing like she remembered. The streets were darker now. The air heavier. Everything had changed. She was part of something now. A cog in the machine. And there was no turning back. Eric's face flashed in her mind again. She had to save him. But at what cost? And what would she become in the process? The night stretched out before Charlotte like an endless road, shrouded in uncertainty and shadow. She followed the enforcer through the narrow, dimly lit alley, the weight of the gun still heavy in her hand. The silence between them felt suffocating, but her mind was too clouded to even consider speaking. She couldn't stop thinking about Eric. Every time she closed her eyes, his face appeared, pleading, afraid. She had promised herself she would save him. But as she stepped further into this dangerous world, she couldn't shake the feeling that in saving him, she might lose everything she once was. The enforcer led her to a black van parked at the end of the alley. The engine hummed softly, its dark windows reflecting the harsh streetlights. Without a word, he opened the side door and gestured for her to enter. Charlotte hesitated but climbed inside, her heart thudding in her chest. The interior was stark cold. A few metal crates were stacked in the back, and the faint smell of gasoline lingered in the air. The driver, a silent man with a scar running down his cheek, nodded as she entered, but didn't speak. The door slammed shut behind her, and the van began to move, its tires rumbling against the cracked pavement. Charlotte sat in the back, staring at her hands, the gun still clenched in her fingers. Her thoughts swirled. She had crossed a line, stepped into a world where survival was a currency, and morality was a distant memory. Eric's life was in her hands. But what was she becoming? The van moved through the darkened city streets, heading toward an unknown destination. The glow of neon signs flickered by, each one a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. But as they sped through the empty roads, Charlotte couldn't ignore the sense of finality settling over her. She wasn't just walking into a new life. She was running away from everything she had known. From her past. From the person she once was. And when the van finally came to a stop, and the doors swung open, Charlotte knew, deep down, that there was no going back. She stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. The enforcer stood in front of her, waiting, his eyes unreadable. "This is it," he said quietly. "The game has started." Charlotte took a deep breath, steadying herself. She couldn't change what had already happened. She was in it now. All of it. And as she followed the enforcer into the unknown, she realized that whatever came next, she had to see it through to the end. For Eric. For herself. But the cost? That would be something she would have to face when it was too late to turn back. The door slammed shut behind her, and the darkness swallowed her whole. And the story of Charlotte Lindström, now bound to the world of shadows and betrayal, came to its final, inevitable chapter.